Hello there, you're watching Left, Right and Centre on NDTV. I'm Maha Siddiqui. Some key transactional decisions have been made at the Prime Minister Modi's meeting with UAE President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The central banks of India and UAE signed a memorandum of understanding to promote the use of local currencies for transactions, which means trade being done in rupee and dirham. The two sides also decided to link India's UPI with the Instant Payment Platform (IPP) of UAE. This is expected to make fund transfer fast, convenient, safe and cost-effective. This after the UPI was made applicable in France as well. On the other hand, since the Ukraine war, China is using more of yuan to buy Russian commodities. Yuan's share in Russia's import settlements in 2022 rose to 23% from 4% as per reports. Imports of Russian oil, piped gas, coal, metals have all mostly been settled in yuan. Two examples here of de-dollarization of trade. So we ask, do these early moves have the potential to change the global economic dynamics? Let me bring in our guests who are joining us here on the show. Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist, Bank of Baroda. Ashwini Rana, Founder, Voice of Banking, Bank Expert and former Canara Bank personnel. Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Senior Economist, Visiting Professor, Centre for Development, University of Bath in the UK. Madan Sabnavis, I want to first come to you. How do these moves really that we are seeing of trade in local currencies help the countries?
See, the main idea of having trade in local currencies is there's less dependence on hard currencies, especially the dollar. Ever since we had the Ukraine war and a ban was put by the US on dealings with Russia, I think that was what the trigger point was. And I think it makes a lot of sense for countries to consider doing bilateral trade using their local currencies. But the major issue which is there is that is one of acceptability. So there's one thing that the RBI recently, I think it was last week, they came out with a report, a draft report, which was actually making suggestions where you're trying to internationalize the currency. Now, the kind of dealings which we're having with probably UAE on a bilateral basis makes a lot of sense. It's a very good beginning. It's something which has to be done. But for it to work, it needs to have wider acceptability. Because the basic question is that a country which receives rupees should be able to use the rupees to buy goods from other countries. Correct. So that's where there is a problem. In fact, I think there's a similar problem we're having with Russia, where if you're saying that we're going to do the trade with Russia in terms of rupees, what will Russia do with the rupees? So I think that's where the basic issue is. So what makes sense is that a group of countries sit together and decide to begin with to keep doing trade using their local currencies. But we should remember that in this kind of a game, what happens is the country which has a deficit has an incentive to use local currency. A country which has surplus will always be reluctant unless it's able to get hold of hard currencies. So I think a beginning is required, and I think what India is doing makes a lot of sense. But I think this is something which will grow over time. And we should remember one thing, the last point I'd like to make out here is when we want to internationalize the currency, I think the country credit rating is something which comes into the picture. Because today, if you look at it, why do people hold the dollar, the euro, or you're holding the pound and Japanese yen? All these countries have a very good country rating of A+ and above. If you look at India, we're just about investment grade at BBB+ minus. I think that's one of the reasons why the government has been doing a lot of talking with the rating agencies, trying to convince them that we need to improve the rating. Because at the end of it, it's a case of acceptability. Even if you look at China, for example, who accepts the yuan? Today, if you look at overall forex reserves in the world, China doesn't have a share of more than 2%. It's the largest economy in the world. So I think acceptability is something which has to be built, and we're taking the steps in the right direction.
Ashwini Rana, can you think of any more challenges here apart from the acceptability of the currency as has been pointed out by Madan Sabnavis there?
Yes, definitely challenges are there because intertrade is for international trade. You have to have an understanding between the countries, and rightly Madanji said that what they will do with the rupees. See, this dominance of dollar, every country wants to minimize that dominance of the US dollars. For that, separate groups, BRICS and Asian countries and African countries, they are working and they are making the understanding to how we can go for a bilateral trade. So it will take time, but definitely it will impact the the local currency, and it will reduce the dominance, because you will see time to time these Federal Reserve's decisions, sanctions of US on some countries affect their trade, their economy. So this will definitely reduce the dominance, and bilateral trade definitely give the boost to the countries for bilateral trade.
Okay, but Professor Mehrotra, recently the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar had spoken about no plans among BRIC nations for a common currency, so to speak. Now, like the EU, why do other groupings hesitate in having a common currency then?
Well, I think all the conceptual issues have already been laid out by Madan. So, you know, BRICS countries don't trade a great deal with each other. I think we somehow seem to think that, you know, just because BRICS got together, because one fine day Goldman Sachs actually put this acronym together, we've got the 4 major emerging market economies or 5 major. Anyway, so there's no particular logical reason why the BRICS are suddenly going to start changing. Now, let's just remember to keep a sense of perspective, since the conceptual issues have been well laid out by Madan. Let me give you a sense of history here.
Sure.
Please remember that rupee trade or local currency trade is something which India has engaged in for something close to 70 years. Guess with who? With the former Soviet Union all the way till 1990, and with the remaining East European countries. This is nothing new. Now, this is point 1 that we need to keep in mind. Point 2 that we need to keep in mind is that most countries are attempting to diversify away from dollars to other currencies, particularly to the euro, when they keep, you know, foreign exchange reserves.
Okay.
India is also one of those countries which is attempting to do that. Now, let me make a third point. In respect of Russia, with whom we've been trading in recent times, in very recent times, post-Ukraine, in rupees, particularly for oil. Now, trouble is, we want to buy many things from Russia, especially oil, gas, etc., but we have not much to sell to them, which is the point that Madan was making, that a deficit country like India, which is not being able to export. Now, what does Russia do with all the rupees it is accumulating in India, in Indian bank account? The discussion has already started some months back that they want dollars for it. Inevitably, they are short of dollars. They're not being able to sell in many things in dollars on account of economic sanctions. So we are already in this situation where the surplus that the Russians are holding in rupees are having to be converted into dollars. So, you know, let's just keep a sense of perspective on this before we go all gaga and gung-ho about, we are just about to become an international currency, yada, yada, yada.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. That is why we are having this discussion to understand what does this entail and what does it hold in the future. Madan Sabnavas, was this one of the reasons why India and Iran couldn't continue with rupee real sort of a transaction, because that was being done via Bank of Baroda, if I'm not mistaken?
See, that was a totally different kind of a situation, because if you look at the size of Iran and you look at the size of Russia, they're totally different. Next, if you look at the status or the economic powerhouse that India has become in recent times, we were definitely not that when we had those sanctions on Iran. So today it becomes very difficult for a country like US to say that, look, if you're going to deal with Russia, we're going to black you out. That's not just possible. It was something which was possible at that point of time when there were these sanctions on Iran. So I think India's progressed a lot. We made a name for ourselves. And I think the diplomatic relations which we have established with countries makes it difficult to take retaliatory action. So I think this is probably the right time. And I think this discussion is on the drawing rooms of all countries. And I think we will be moving forward. It's a very, very slow process, I agree, because even if you look at the time when the Ukraine war started and we were talking of de-dollarization, if I look at the IMF data and you look at what are the reserves held in the form of dollars, that 60% share has not really changed, which means that people are still holding on to the dollar. And as what Ashwini ji had actually mentioned is very pertinent, because we need to get out of it, because now everything that the Federal Reserve does, everything that the US does in terms of quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, all that has repercussions on the rest of the world. So I think the de-dollarization is something which is necessary. It's imperative. We need to start talking about it, see how we can work it out. And then I'm quite sure in another 20, 30 years, there will be a solution, because that's the amount of time it took for the euro. Of course, in the current situation, maybe it will take a shorter period of time, but there has to be an acceptance, as I said. That's the major important thing. And the point you made about BRICS, look at the five countries part. We're all totally different. India is a democracy. One is a dictatorship. One we cannot trust. South Africa is in ruins. So is the case with the Brazilian economy. So these kind of countries which have different rates of inflation, different rates of growth, it's difficult to actually come together. If you look at the euro, how did the euro come about? There were certain norms which were maintained. And we saw that is not something which was tenable, because when we had the Greek crisis, we realized that Greece was actually fudging numbers. But the whole idea was we all make sure there's fiscal discipline. Inflation is kept at a range of at 2%. All countries signed up to that. Now look at India, look at Russia, look at China, look at South Africa, look at Brazil. We all have different kind of numbers. So it's a theoretical concept, BRICS. Probably it was a good thing which Goldman Sachs came out. At least that was an idea, countries getting together. But we'll have to see if we're able to work out in terms of a common currency. But I think what India should try to do is work along with South Asian nations, maybe East Asia, try and get in also Japan. You always need some strong currency, a strong country. I think talks should begin in this particular region, which can then spread to the rest of the world.
Ashwini Rana, I also want to talk about the UPI. Now, in both France and UAE, where the Prime Minister has gone recently, we are seeing UPI being applicable. How does this play out?
Definitely, this is the sort of the de-dollarization, you can say, because your country will be acceptable there. In rupees, you can have a transaction without any hassle. So it is a good attempt. By any way, it is right that overnight you cannot stop the US dollar. It will take time. Firstly, you can have an understanding in Asian countries, South Asian countries. Then you have to see for euro. These European countries, how much time they have taken to make the acceptability of the euro. So it is not a small thing, it is a big thing. Yet you have to change the, because interchange the account settlement, everything you have to think. For that, definitely it is a good move, UPI, and definitely country to country, if it will be there, then definitely you will have a less impact of dollar, and you will have your rupee transactions acceptability. Definitely it will be impact, and we will be in the world to accept rupee.
Professor Mehrotra, at the start I mentioned how China has been taking commodities from Russia in yuan. Is there some element of competition as well now that we are seeing with the currencies in China and India are both trying to internationalize that?
Look, China's contribution to world GDP as well as world trade is much greater than ours. We are a fraction of China's share in both GDP, world GDP as well as world trade. So inevitably, 10 or 15 years ago already, China had begun to make some efforts in the direction of making the renminbi an internationalized currency. It has very significant economic relations with the Southeast Asian countries, but not just with the Southeast Asian countries. Now, has all of this resulted in the yuan suddenly becoming an international currency? Not really, right? Not really. Even the Chinese themselves hold most of their $4 trillion foreign exchange reserves in mostly USD and to some extent in Euro and Japanese yen. So, the Chinese, who are way ahead of us in this effort, have not made massive headway. So we should be reasonably conservative in our assessment of how this is going to take on or move on.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Madan Sabnawis, this is a more, if I can put it that way, philosophical question. But in a globalized world, if local currencies are going to be used for trading, say, going forward, others want to do the same, aren't we creating islands, economic islands, so to speak?
No, I think what you're saying is right. But if you've seen that globalization has turned out to be very one-sided, where certain countries have benefited and others are not. So we've seen it even in terms of trade. Like today, when you talk of something like the World Trade Organization, we say that there has to be free flow of trade. But so therefore, the US would like to make sure that the Indian economy is opened up and you're able to send your goods to India. You want to make sure your investment flows in. But the reverse doesn't really hold in terms of services. So suppose we have seen the Indian IT sector or IT professionals who want to go to the US, we have a lot of restrictions out there. And what we have seen is that ever since we had the Lehman crisis in 2008, there has been a tendency for everybody to become protectionist. Everybody's trying to protect their own economies. And this has been exacerbated after COVID. Now, I think everybody's inward looking, everybody's trying to protect their own economies. And I think when you're looking at currencies, we also realize that if you're actually saying a philosophical question is that why should the dollar have ever been the anchor currency? Okay, that is something which happened post Second World War. We had the IMF coming up. We had the SDR, which went down into the dollar. But there's no reason as to why the American dollar should have been the anchor currency. But it did because those were the circumstances in those days. And today we have seen that both on the political side, where these kind of sanctions can be imposed on any country, your foreign exchange reserves can be impounded by US theoretically. Holding onto the dollar is no longer a safe asset. Okay, that's the important part. I'm quite sure that when Russia had invested their reserves in dollars, they must have felt that, look, this is a 100% safe asset. But today we see because politically it may no longer be so. Similarly, if we're talking of the economy, because we are all linked to the dollar, we need to react to everything that happens in the US. So I think globalization, to my mind, is definitely diminishing. And I think every country is talking about themselves. Even today, when we say Atmanirbhar, we say Make in India, aren't we also doing the same thing? If you look at China, they're also doing the same thing. If you look at England, why did they move out from the European Union? It was the same kind of considerations which you have. You want to protect your own economy. So I think things are turning protectionist, and I think the way in which we thought globalization would work hasn't quite worked out that way. And I think we will have to live with this new reality.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Many thanks to all our panelists for joining us here on this discussion this evening.